Alright, so in this chapter we're going to continue on with our modeling time-lapse here, specifically working on this back building. So you can see I arranged the piece of concept so I could see, what we're dealing with. And starting from the ground up, I am going to build a curve here using the EP curve tool. Snap these points to the grid so we're nice and mathematical. And you might have noticed that I built this curve off of the original block out, seeing as how I had already figured out that I wanted a piece here and I want it to be roughly the size. It's easy to kind of just draw a curve and know that you've already determined, what the big shape is. Again, messing with that curve a little bit just to get a bigger radius. And now I'm going to extrude these edges back and soften them. And what we've got is a nice wall to start with. So like I said in the previous chapter, I always like to start from the ground up. So I'm refining this piece a little bit so that it fits with this wall that I'm going to do next. And I don't want any of those verts hidden, so I just took the verts along the back edge and used the lattice tool to kind of uniformly snap them to the angle of the wall, just so that it's nice and neat and we don't have any verts just slamming through that wall. Go ahead and delete some of these faces here, and let's refine this piece a little bit more. Again, on this piece I started with the piece I had used for the block out, and we're just going to do some polygon modeling on top of that, do some extruding, bevel some of these edges, and just clean it up, make sure we don't have any points that aren't getting us anything. You might have saw right there that I took the piece and I mirrored it. And the way that I mirrored it was just using the scale tool and scaling it in the opposite direction, giving it a negative scale value. Sometimes you'll do that, you'll need to flip the faces, but that's how I will mirror things. You'll see me doing a lot of mirroring. In fact, right here what I'm doing is some stealing. I'd figured out in the block out that I wanted the same kind of canisters up along this wall, and Cecil had put those in his concept. This is very similar to something he had done where he had an element he liked and he just reused it. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm taking these canisters, which I like, and I'm going to reuse them, scale them down a little bit, and put them along this wall. And not only will this look pretty cool, I think, it'll also be pretty efficient because I can use some of the same texturing that I will end up doing when I go to texture the pieces on the other side. I just reuse these textures for here. So one of the techniques that I use a lot when I'm moving pieces around or snapping pieces, you might have noticed that I changed the pivot point quite a bit. And in Maya you can center the pivot point. There's a command to center pivot point, which might not always put it where you would like it. But you can also hold down the D key on the keyboard. And then as you're holding down D, a combination of holding down X if you want to snap the pivot point to the grid, or holding down V to snap it to verts will allow you to move your pivot point around. And when you're translating pieces and you want to keep your verts on the grid, you want to make sure that your pivot point is always on the grid or snapped to a vert. So if you watch, you'll notice that I do that quite a bit. You'll see the pivot point moving around. Also, you saw when I revolved that piece near the beginning of this chapter that I snapped its pivot point, kind of offset a little bit from where the curve was, because that's what it used to revolve. So pivot points are very important for revolving, offsetting curves, just translating objects around the scene. So remember that holding down D on the keyboard will allow you to move your pivot point around. Another technique that I use a lot that you may have noticed, and it's something I don't think I explained in any previous chapter, is a lot of times I'll take an edge and double click that edge to select the loop. And then I'll go up to the bonus tools menu, and under the bonus tools menu there is a command that is create curve from edge, which is what I just used now in the video. And instead of having to use the EP curve tool and hold down V and draw a new edge by snapping it to existing geometry, I can just double click on that edge on the geometry to select the loop and create a new curve off that. So a lot of times when I will build something off another thing by double-clicking those edges, creating a new curve off that edge, and then what I did right now with this kind of trim on the top is then offset the edges and do a loft between them. So again, that tool is called Create Curve from Edges, and it's found up in the Bonus Tools menu. And it's just one of those nice little time-saver tools. I encourage you to go up to the Bonus Tools tab and see what a lot of the tools are. There's no really new modeling feature that doesn't exist in Maya there, but there's a lot of things that are just kind of utility and time-saving things, and that's one of them. So let's get back to what I'm working on right now. I'm trying to fill in the bottom of this trim, so I use the Create Polygon tool and held down V to snap a new polygon to the bottom of that edge to fill it in. And now moving on to the other side of the wall here, I'm going to create a couple primitives just so that I can create a new curve and use these to snap the points of the curve to them, just so I know I get nice rounded edges, just like that. And that's another one of those things that I do all the time. Instead of just kind of trying to eyeball it, I'll bring in a primitive and model to it, snap the verts of the edges to it. And building on top of this block out I made, we just refined that shape a little bit and then deleted the block out. Just a little bit, move this piece over. And while I'm doing this, I'm also looking at the concept art. Make sure I'm not getting too far off, or in maybe some cases I'm keeping to one of the elements exactly. And so now I'm continuing to refine this piece using the same technique I just did to build kind of the initial piece we're working off, making a bunch of primitives, using the cut faces tool to just kind of add some slices in here. And now I'm going to use the primitive as a guide to kind of trim out a semicircle in this piece. And then just duplicate the piece down a few times so I don't have to do the same work over, and we'll get rid of those primitives. It's important, if you use this technique of kind of modeling curves and snapping them to primitives, if you're using anything that's circular or round, make sure that the amount of edges that it has is something along the lines of the power of 2. And what I mean is, if you make a cylinder, make sure that it has 8 sides or 16 sides or 32 sides, something like that, because that will correspond with texturing and also with your grid. And you'll recall that in one of the earlier chapters when I was setting up my grid for the scene, I put a major grid line every 8 units. And again, I do that to correspond with texturing, because textures follow this kind of power of 2. You have textures that are 16 by 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, etc. They all follow that rule. So if you build geometry that's on the grid and is kind of snapped to those increments, when you go do texturing, you'll see that texturing just kind of lines up perfectly with things. I know I've mentioned that a few times throughout these chapters, and it's kind of hard to make sense of until you go through the whole process. So just trust me on this one and set up your grid and primitives that way, and you'll see that when you go to do your texturing, it'll make life a lot easier. So I do realize that through this time-lapse videos I've been rambling quite a bit about a lot of different things. You might find that it's useful to watch these and turn me off, actually, if you want to concentrate more and just kind of pay attention to what I'm doing, if that's what you want to get out of this DVD. Hopefully just by watching, a lot of this will make sense, and you'll see a lot of the things that I do to build out a 3D environment. Or maybe just to get an idea of what the quality standard is. All of this to me is still pretty much the bare minimum we need in terms of geometry. When we go add textures and stuff, a lot of times we'll end up even refining these pieces further, but we don't know that yet. Until we go and do the texturing, we're just kind of doing as good a job as we can with the modeling. In a perfect world, all the work we're doing right now would be our final modeling for the game. But once you go and add fog to a level, or bloom, or lighting, or textures, you'll find that you never are ever done with a piece until, the game ships, really. And so we do as good as we can right now, hoping that, there's minimal rework, but then knowing that other things will cause us to have to refine the geometry yet again. But this should be, 90%. It should be able to take us as far as we need to go. We don't want to model real sloppy and then have to fix it later. We want to get it as clean and neat and finished as we can at this stage. So this lower piece that I just built on the bottom here was done using that technique I explained earlier, where I grabbed the edges on the bottom of the piece above it and then used in the bonus tools the create curve from edges tool. And then I created a new profile and extruded it along that curve. And so these two meet up nice and neat since they were built kind of off each other. And now I'm going in and I'm refining the profile curve a little bit more, just so that I don't have any overlap. Some of the polygons are intersecting other polygons. And now I'm just comparing it to the concept art. Make sure that it looks good. And after doing that, I see I have to refine the bottom a little bit. It was getting a little bit crowded. We want to make sure the player has enough room to run around. And that looks pretty decent. So let's go up here and work on the arch. I'm going to make a cylinder, give it 32 sides. I think that will be smooth enough. And kind of figure out where I want to center it. Now that I have it where I want it, just go ahead and delete the faces we don't want. Reverse those faces so we have kind of the underside of this arch. And get it to a nice grid spacing. And then I'll double click to select those edges, create a curve out of those edges and offset it. And then we'll go ahead and loft it. Snap these points down. And now we have the starting point for this arch area. Take that inner edge and push it in a little bit to create a, something that's a little bit beveled. And we'll continue with the same process. Offset these curves, move them in space, and loft. And that's pretty good for now. So now what I'm going to do is select this outer edge and extrude those edges, and then just grab some of these points and snap them over here to create kind of the wall that this curve is attached to. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that all these verts along the bottom are snapped flat, and any vert that is sitting on top of another one is welded together. Had to go ahead and adjust this piece on the bottom. It was looking a little bit thin, and once I built the arch, it became apparent that I had to thicken that up a little bit. Don't want anything looking weak. Everything should look nice and heavy and massive. So I'm going to make a few more adjustments to this, kind of center the inner ring of verts, and then using the scale tool, I'm going to mirror it. And then I welded it together and just got rid of those inner verts that weren't really getting us a whole lot. And here, just making a little comparison against the concept and the previous piece I made, just make sure everything stays consistent. So this arch by itself is kind of boring looking. So now we're going to use kind of the center edges of this to create a new curve. And we're just going to make kind of a cornerstone-ish piece on the top here, just to break up that long line that we're getting from the curve. Again, you never want to have edges that just kind of continue on forever. You want to break things up, and that's what we're doing here. Creating a little piece, nice detail element sit on the top. You see how much more heavy that looks, more massive. And we will also refine the left side of this arch as well, just to make it so it has a different look than the right-hand side. And what I'm going to do to build out the left-hand side of this arch is pretty tricky. I'm going to go ahead and add in a cut here, and then another one, both centered on the edges, and then bring in another primitive and rotate it so that it's lined up with this edge. Just kind of eyeball it for now. And we'll go ahead and cut that out. And we're not going to do that to every piece here. We're just going to make one. But the trick is, since I started with a cylinder that had 32 sides, I know it's 11.25 degrees between each side. So if I make one piece and then snap it to the edge above it and rotate by 11.25, it will fit perfectly in line along the curve, which you'll see after I kind of fiddle with this piece a little bit with a lattice, just to make the base wider. Once I have that, now I can snap it up here, rotate 11.25 degrees, and you'll see it fits perfectly in there. And then holding down Shift D, they'll all line up. So I actually made a mistake here. When I duplicated the pieces, I forgot to delete the inner faces where it's connecting, so I could never have welded this together So instead of going in and selecting those all, I'll just delete all those and start again. Again, snapping it up, adjusting the pivot point so it will snap to the inner ring of the cylinder, and then offsetting everything and rotating at 11.25 degrees will make everything line up perfectly. And now I can take these pieces and weld them together into one arch. And the way that I caught that is when I grabbed those inner edges to soften them, they wouldn't soften. And then I realized that, oops, I had forgotten to delete those inner faces. So that is another trick that I use sometimes to make sure that everything is sewn together and welded nice, is I'll try and take a whole object and soften it. And if you get the softened edges on everything, that means that all your verts are now welded together correctly. If some edges stay hard, that can show you that maybe you forgot to delete a face, therefore it won't allow the verts to weld together. It's just a nice little trick. It's one of those ways to make sure you're double checking your work and haven't made any errors. Anyways, moving on here, we're going to add a little bit more detail to this wall. It's just kind of a big blank surface, which sometimes you want. You don't want to just jam-pack an environment full of detail, but you also don't want to do the opposite where it's boring and you just have a lot of big flat faces. And so I kind of determined that this top left-hand corner here was maybe a little bit too flat, a little bit too boring. So I drew some new curves and kind of created an interesting piece here. And we're just going to trim it off. Make sure we don't have any polygons just jamming through geometry, which is messy and will light poorly. So there we go. And we'll go ahead and actually trim this out of the back wall and make this into one piece. And I'm going to use the Create Polygon tool, hold down V, snap to the edges, create a new face, weld it together, which you've seen me do a bunch of times now, and that's much more interesting. Refine it a little bit. Add one more kind of level to this. And there we go. And I'm going to use the Maya cleanup tool to make sure that everything is 3 and 4 sided, that we have triangles and quads. I prefer to leave everything as quads if possible. I don't like working in triangles just because it can get a little bit messy. Most game engines will take your quads and triangulate them for you. So I like to just work in quads for cleanliness. A few triangles here and there isn't the end of the world, but I try to avoid it just so I can work faster. And what I'm doing to the right-hand side of this arch is very similar to what I did to the left-hand side. Just kind of trying to give it an interesting shape here, make it look a little bit more science fiction. I felt like the face was just a little bit too flat. And I created a couple curves, and when I lofted them, it got a little bit messy, so now I'm just cleaning it up after the fact with the Split Polygon tool. And we'll just go ahead and do the same thing we did on the left-hand side. Just integrate this into that piece. Create a few curves off the edges and let's offset them. There we go. And this piece didn't work out totally smooth. You notice that I made a piece and I discarded it. And I was able to extract some nice curves off of it, but in the end it wasn't really working out too well. But it enabled me to build this piece. And we'll go ahead and sew this in, just like the other side, and we'll take these edges straight back. Now it looks a little bit more interesting. It takes away the squareness that we had on top of the arch here and gives it more of an interesting profile. A little bit more sci-fi. And clean it up, delete some of the faces that we don't need. And take this wall and make sure that it's integrated with the lower wall. Extend that trim. Go ahead and snap those verts to the grid so that we have a nice 90-degree angle. And it's feeling pretty good. So now that I've worked out a lot of the big shapes on this wall here, we're just going to do some mirroring. Mirror this wall too, just so we can kind of fill that in from the front and back and get started on the roof. You see I chopped it in half because I just want to do the work on one half, and then we'll go ahead and mirror that back. So we're just going to make some minor adjustments to where the verts are. Still keeping with the same feel from Cecil's concept. And I don't want the profile of this lower edge to be totally flat, so I'm just going to go and make an 8-sided cylinder, clip off half of it, and later we'll integrate that a little bit better. But first I want to add some bevels to this roof just to make it not look so flimsy. Go ahead and harden those edges. And we'll just snap these to the closest grid points, clean it up a little bit. Now we can take this cylinder that we made, make a few cuts with the cut faces tool, and mirror it, turn it 90 degrees, and use it for some more detail for this roof. And that's looking pretty good, so we'll just go ahead and adjust our pivot point and mirror this over. And clean up some of the faces so that we can weld it together. And there we go. So now let's move on to this sci-fi chimney looking thing and draw out a new profile. Just rough that out on top of the block out and refine it a little bit. Make sure it's nice and neat. I'm going to go ahead and make a 8-sided cylinder here to use as a guide to snap these points, just so that curve is nice and even. And put that in place. A lot of times when I draw a curve, you'll see that I have to move it into place. That's because by default it's just kind of drawing it at the origin, and I have no problem snapping it back. If I wanted to keep it in a certain spot, I could just make an object live, and you'll remember that that will snap the curve to it. But since we're so close to the origin in this scene, I'm not having too much of an issue just kind of drawing them and then moving them into place. And you may have noticed that I'm just working on a quarter of the object right now till I get it right. No sense on working on the whole thing at once. And then when I'm done, just spin it around again and get rid of these edges. Go ahead and soften those ones in the middle since we want that to be a nice curve. And adjust it a little bit. Make sure it fits on top of the block out. And add some bevels. The bevel tool wasn't really cutting it right there, so actually by holding down Shift I use the cut faces tool to add a bevel in. And then I'm going to re-quarter this so that I don't have to redo that cut again. And then I'll just hit Control D to duplicate it, use the scale tool to mirror it, and weld it back together. And so now I'm going to go ahead and use the fill hole tool to fill in this polygon, and then use the split polygon tool to connect it and delete the face I don't want. Adjust our chimney a little bit. And now we're going to do some steeling from the other side. I've made a lot of trims that I like, so we might as well reuse them. And here's a profile that worked pretty good on the other side. We'll go ahead and use it here for the base as well. But this time I'm going to use a tool called the mirror cut tool to make this kind of corner happen. Usually I'll just duplicate a piece and then turn it and use the cut faces tool to get a nice 45-degree cut. The mirror cut tool can do that for you. My issue with it is that a lot of times it will delete faces or take materials off faces. Still, it's a valuable tool to use, but I don't use it a whole lot just because if you have UV mapping or something on there, sometimes it can get destroyed. Still, it can probably save you a few steps, and maybe you'll have more luck with it than I have. That being said, I do use it. And what I'm doing right here is I'm stealing another trim from the other side, and I'm going to repurpose this for the center area of this sci-fi pillar, smokestack, whatever it is. And like I said a couple times already, this is a very efficient way to work, because eventually when I do my texturing, I don't have to texture a million different pieces. They'll only have, in a scene like this, maybe 6 or 7 different trim pieces, and I just reuse them all over, saving memory, time, texture space. So the front of this section of the building right now is far too flat. So I used the split polygon tool here to trim out a little, not really a door, but just kind of a recessed panel. And so after pushing that back and making that look a little bit more interesting, let's do some more reuse. I'm going to go ahead and steal the roof section and repurpose it for the top of this panel. And why not steal this box as well? Put that over here. And this is really speeding up my modeling process because I don't have to keep building new things from scratch. I've done some stuff that worked, so why not use it all over? And there are a lot of games that build entire levels this way, where you have asset builders that just build out a bunch of interesting parts, and then they'll give that to level designers, and they'll take the parts and just assemble it into what they think is a cool layout. I've had the opportunity to work at a few different studios, and each one has been distinctly different in how they assembled environments. I've seen it where one artist takes an entire level from start to finish with all the modeling, texturing, and lighting. I've also seen it where it's been very compartmentalized, where certain people have made certain things and then a different person will go in and do the assembly. Each way works, each way has its pros and cons, but I hope that the things I show in this DVD will be applicable to any kind of workflow that you encounter. So what I'm going to do right now is speed up the time lapse a little bit just so we can get through building this back building. I think if I make it a little bit faster, you still should be able to see what I'm doing and it should make sense. But I'll do my best to kind of continue narrating on top of this so that I can explain what I'm doing and what I'm thinking. And what I'm doing right now is some more stealing from another portion. I took a trim that I had already done up on the kind of the top left section underneath the arch, and I'm just reusing this shape, repurposing it for this edge. And we're going to go ahead and push this back a little bit to make this wall not so flat and a little bit irregular. I don't want everything to look so cubish. I want to kind of add some indentations. Go ahead and bevel that edge and snap those points to the grid. Extrude those edges, extrude them again, kind of clean it up. Use the split polygon tool to clean that back up. And now the lower half of this is a little bit more interesting instead of just being just kind of a box. And let's do even more reuse. I'm going to take this pillar and repurpose it for this lower section again. Made it a little bit thinner. So once I do the texturing, I might have to adjust the UVs on this piece. And now that we got those guys in there, let's just bring up the concept art. Make sure that we're still tracking to keep a similar look and feel. And we're going to reuse this light fixture from the right hand side. Place that around as well as this kind of fluorescent looking one. And now I want to check what we've done so far against the right hand building. So I'm just going to kind of frame both of those really quickly just to make sure that we're keeping consistent look. And now I'm going to go in here using the split polygon tool, holding down X to snap it to the grid. Just kind of model out some paneling here. Go ahead and take those edges and push them back. And then once we do that, we'll go and clean up these extra verts and edges that we have. Just like so. And then I'm going to go make a primitive box. And we're just going to kind of box model this a little bit to make a little bracket piece. Make a few cuts, pull this out. Just something that looks like some kind of, sci-fi clasp, something like that. There we go. We'll duplicate that over. Now, depending on what kind of game engine you're working on, this might be way too high poly, or it might not be enough polygons. That's totally going to depend. Some of these details, like the panel that I'm making, you could put that in texture. I'm going to leave it as a model right now just so you can kind of get the idea of what I want this building to look like. But it might be that when I do the texturing for this, I take those new panels that I made and actually just bake that into a texture and redo the modeling to make it flat. So for now, this is all just a best guess. Things will have to change, like I mentioned before, once we do lighting and texturing. So I'm cleaning up this lower section a little bit, got rid of some of the faces that we weren't going to see. And we're going to elaborate on this, kind of like what we did with the paneling, just so it's not a big, flat, boring face. we're going to create something that has a little bit more interest. And so using the split polygon tool and some extrusions, some bevels. Here I just started with a primitive cube, and I'm just messing around, pushing and pulling the points. In the case of this piece, I didn't really know what I wanted. I was just kind of messing around. Selected a bunch of edges. In fact, here I selected all the edges and did a bevel on it, which can be a little bit messy, but gives you a nice rounded look sometimes. And then I'm going to repurpose some of these elements from the building on the right just to make this little panel section here look more busy. Go ahead, use the split polygon tool and delete some of these faces that we don't need, just to give that kind of another level. It was looking a little bit flat. So I'm not done with this lower wall yet. I'm going to delete this edge and then use the split polygon tool to rough out another panel size shape. And then what I did right there is I selected those edges and then I beveled them, which is a trick to kind of duplicate up an edge. And then using the insert edge loop tool, created another cut down the middle of them and just pushed that back. Again, here I'm using the split polygon tool to make kind of a interesting panel looking shape. And what I'm going to do with these is actually delete these faces once I get them how I like, and then use the inner ring of edges to create new curves. And then we're going to offset these curves and create more paneling that way. So still doing more of the same, creating a curve off the inner edge, offsetting the curve, and filling in the holes using the fill hole tool. Just go ahead and refine this face a little bit more. And now I'm going to add more detail to this face by starting with a sphere, chopping off the bottom half. And we'll go ahead and use the bridge tool to connect those up. And play with the size and spacing of these, just to give us some kind of, I don't know, some repetitive detail on top of this panel. And now a little bit more of the same. Just take some of these edges, make sure they're on the grid. Use the split polygon tool to add some more indentations here. And that's about it for that lower wall for now. We'll put some of these details back in that we had reused from the right-hand building. And so now let's move on to the far left-hand side of the structure. Figure out what we're going to do there. Draw out a new curve using the EP curve tool. That looks pretty interesting. You'll notice that I deleted the block out that was in place. And this will be our lower wall section. I probably could have made this reusing something from a previous piece on the right hand side, but I don't know, I felt like doing something new. It wasn't quite working, so I deleted the lower half, and what I'm going to do is now just use this for the top section, refine it a little bit more to fit, and then we're going to flip it and mirror it so it's kind of like a lower and upper trim as well. There we go. You always want things to look cohesive and together. Geometry should always meet up nicely wherever possible. So now I'm going to steal this edge off here and revolve it around, just so that the lower wall now becomes part of the, I don't know, this looks kind of like a smokestack. Same thing here. I want that upper edge to continue around. And now it looks very cohesive and together. Go ahead and weld these pieces so that they're one, and compare it to the concept art. It's looking pretty good. And make a bottom trim. Again, using that same technique where we stole the edge from the bottom and just did an offset and then a loft. So we're getting pretty close to finishing up this building. Just going to refine the top of this smokestack a little bit more. We'll go ahead and delete the original block out and just using some latticing, some extrusions, go ahead and soften those edges. So for now I'm just using that combo of the lattice tool, extruding edges, softening edges, sometimes the cut faces tool. I'm just trying to get this top thing to look a little bit more significant. Again, converting those edges to verts, then using the lattice tool. We're going to actually make a section of this flat so it's not just perfectly round, and pull some of this down. There we go. That's better than it just being a perfectly round cylinder, in my opinion. And we'll add a little bit of detail here for some piping. And duplicate that up a few times. And these are just nice little elements, very simple to make, but they affect the silhouette nicely. So from far away, instead of it just looking like a big boring cylinder, it has an interesting silhouette to it. So now I'm going to move back down to this lower wall, which it became apparent to me was just kind of flat and boring. And I'm going to add a paneling that's very similar to what we did on the top of the arch, just to kind of pull in a common element. You never want an environment to have a million different styles or looks, but what I'm doing right here is very similar to something we did earlier, so it benefits us in that it looks cohesive. And so duplicating kind of a similar style I used earlier, to me, helps the building look very uniform and together. And like so many pieces I made before, I did this by creating a curve and offsetting it. And I filled in the face right there by using the Create Polygon tool and just making a new polygonal face on the top of that. Go ahead and trim off those edges that we don't need. And then create a curve out of this edge and redo the left-hand side of this panel. Previously it was a little bit too large, so I thinned it up a little bit. And now the last thing we're going to do on this building is this hose area. Up to this point, everything on this back building has been pretty large and massive, so adding a smaller element, something more detailed, I think will kind of help offset that. So just starting with a cylinder, I'm just doing a bunch of extrusions and snapping, using the lattice tool to keep that to the grid. Let's get rid of some of these edges we don't need. Shorten that up and extrude it, just so we can make that a little bit more significant there, a little bit thicker. And pull those edges back so that we don't have a perfect 90-degree angle. And now to make our hose, we're just going to use the EP curve tool to draw out a curve, and then convert it to a CV curve, smooth it out a little bit. And then I'll create a new profile curve from the piece we made and use that and extrude it down the new curve we made for the hose. Go ahead and weld that all together and we'll soften the edges. There we go. And just add some cuts and extrusions. Refine this piece on the top. Make sure the diameter is snapped to the grid. Go ahead and put this into one group. Adjust the pivot point. And just kind of refine where it sits. Probably make that a little bit thinner on the top. It's a little bit too fat. It was actually clipping through part of the arch in an odd way. That's what I was talking about. You always want things to line up nice. So let's just manipulate this curve. And we'll take that same profile we used for the main hose and extrude it down, and then after the extrusion, go ahead and play with the size a little bit more. Now it looks like a nice little kind of bracket fitting. Just push and pull those points. And that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to go in and double click some of these edges and get rid of some of these polygons. There's too many polygons for a piece that's that high up in the scene. I also don't want this hose to just be jammed into this wall here. So I'm going to create a little primitive cylinder and use this to trim out a little area for the hose to go into. Move that guy back down there. Do another set of cuts. Just delete that face. Move it up a little bit. Now the hose has some place it's going into instead of just hitting that wall. So since I've done that, We'll duplicate the piece, mirror it using the scale tool, and weld it together into one piece. And then create some more curves, offset those curves, and just try and create an interesting looking housing. And then we'll create one more curve, offset it, and then push this back. Take those edges, push them back, soften them. Now that hose looks better integrated into that wall. And please remember that the whole time I'm modeling this, I'm continuing to look at the concept art. I'll kind of pop it up on the screen every once in a while during the DVD just to show you, so you can see our progress. But I want you to realize that I'm looking at it a lot more frequently than I'm showing it in the DVD. Anytime I'm about to start on a new section or a little area, I always look at the concept to get ideas, make sure I'm going in the right direction. So we're doing a little bit of cleanup on some of these elements, moving them a little bit closer to the building. And then the final thing we're going to do is add some of the piping that we have on this right-hand building and integrate it into this building as well. And so using the same little piping kit I came up with earlier, I'm just kind of throwing some stuff around until it looks right. Go ahead and bend that around this curve here. And since I have consistent pivot points and the sizes and diameters and everything are on the grid, it's very easy to snap this together. You'll see that fitting snaps right in. And these pipes are nice because it gives the scene kind of a common element. And that about does it for this back archway building. See, I'm going to look at it from a couple different angles here, just to make sure it reads good. Doesn't look too thin, looks nice and heavy. And that'll about do it for now. We'll see you in the next chapter.